This hearing will come to order. This is, if I could ask the members here to take their seats, this hearing is the fourth in our series of hearings to examine the challenges and opportunities facing women worldwide. And today we consider some of the barriers to economic empowerment that women face in developing countries and what that means for them, what it means for their families, what it means for their communities. Now, all countries stand to benefit from women's increased economic participation, but the potential gains are particularly great across the developing world due to the extent of the constraints that so many women face on their ability to own property and their ability to access financial services or work outside the home. Consider that women in more than half the world's countries face limits on their ability to own or manage property, while women-led small to medium-sized firms in developing countries face an estimated $285 billion credit gap. As renowned Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto explained when he testified before this committee, one of the primary sources of stagnant growth and unrest in developing economies is a lack of property rights and the resulting exclusion of workers, including women, from the formal economy. These constraints directly harm women by preventing them from working, from saving, from controlling their own future. And they also harm economic growth and they harm stability. In fact, a multitude of studies project huge gains of global GDP from increases in women's economic participation. Perhaps that is why, after De Soto helped reform the customary laws in his native Peru to make it easier for Peruvian women to work and to own property, women's formal labor force participation increased by 15% in that country. As a result, Peru became one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America. We have reason to be optimistic that this type of success can be replicated. More developing nations are beginning to understand the importance of women's economic inclusion and are taking steps to reform their laws and to address inequities. The U.S. has a critical leadership role to play in continuing to promote such reforms. Our economic, humanitarian, conservation, and many other interests around the world are better served when women are empowered and when economies are growing. And fortunately, new technologies are making women's economic participation more possible than ever. In decades past, microfinance loans were championed to combat extreme poverty. But microfinance is not a cure-all for those living in poverty, particularly those women who face so many additional challenges to their economic empowerment. In recent years, however, an exciting array of financial technologies like mobile money have sprung up across the developing world. This presents tremendous opportunity for impoverished communities and women in particular. And so I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel today about how the U.S. government can better help ensure women's inclusion in the rise of Microfinance 2.0. And I now turn to our ranking member, Mr. Engel, for his remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing. To our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. Ambassador Verveer, I'm especially grateful that you were able to join us. I know you had to rearrange some travel to be here. Your work as our country's first ever ambassador at large for global women's issues made a lasting difference all over the world, and I hope that the administration sees the value of this position and appoints a new ambassador soon, along with so many other positions at state awaiting nominees. We use the word, and I want to thank Dr. Surrey and Ms. Iskendrian. Hope I didn't butcher that. Thank you so much. We look forward to all of you testifying. We use the word empowerment a great deal when it comes to women's and girls' issues, and honestly, I think it's a bit of a misnomer. Women and girls are powerful, and we know what happens when that power and potential are unleashed. Communities thrive, local and global communities grow, societies prosper, and become more inclusive and equitable. If women were full participants in the global economy, we would see an additional $12 through $28 trillion in growth in global GDP by the year 2025. Certain innovations, such as microfinance and mobile banking, have driven progress in women's economic participation, but they aren't close to a silver bullet. A woman without a mobile phone cannot take advantage of these tools. A woman without a birth certificate might not even be able to open a bank account. And in too many places around the world, much bigger roadblocks stand in the way of women exercising their full potential, roadblocks caused by poverty or lack of opportunity or by legal barriers or cultural and societal norms that treat women as second-class citizens. So when it comes to promoting economic access and participation for women, I think we should focus on getting these obstacles out of the way and make it easier for women and girls around the world to put their power to work. Now, in my view, making economies more inclusive for women is simply the right thing to do. It's just wrong that women anywhere are denied access to the same economic opportunities as men, and that's true in the United States as well. We might not want to deal with it, we might not want to confront it, but it's true. But this is the Foreign Affairs Committee, so we also need to ask, why is women's economic opportunity a foreign policy priority? Well, it's easy. All those benefits of women's full economic participation I mentioned earlier, stronger, more stable societies, are also in our national interest. We want to see economies thrive, governments become more responsive, countries become stronger partners on the global stage. Full participation of women is directly tied to these outcomes. So from a strategic standpoint, this is good, smart policy that strengthens American security. The aim of our policy, then, should be to identify and meet the challenges that hold women back from full economic participation. When we start to look at those challenges, we find that women's economic participation is closely tied to a range of other issues that disadvantage women and girls in the developing world. For example, a young girl who's denied an education won't become financially literate or learn the skills needed to compete in the marketplace. Girls forced into child marriage won't have the chance to contribute to their local economies. Women who are victims of gender-based violence and domestic abuse are less likely to get ahead economically. Perhaps most importantly, access to quality health care, including family planning, is critical to women's economic success. The evidence is indisputable. Improving women's access to contraception improves their economic well-being. Women who are able to plan and even delay childbirth are more likely to get an education, raise their standards of living, and climb out of poverty. That's one reason American policy has focused on expanding access to family planning around the world. These efforts have seen good results. In the 27 countries with the biggest USAID-supported programs, the rate of modern contraception use has risen from under 10% a half-century ago to 37% today. A good jump, but it shows we still have a long way to go. Now, the Trump administration has said that it supports efforts to empower women and girls around the world, but its budget proposal tells a different story. The Trump budget completely zeroes out funding for international family planning and reproductive health and eliminates American support for the United Nations Population Fund, the largest purchaser and distributor of contraception globally. On top of that, the administration has reinstated and expanded the global gag rule, which we know has devastating effects on women's health around the world. This is a disgrace which will set women back across the globe. Addressing women's economic participation requires a broad-based, integrated, detail-oriented, and comprehensive approach that deals with all the issues I mentioned, plus a host of others. The wrong approach is to cut our diplomacy and development by nearly a third. Fortunately, Congress has the last word on how much we spend on foreign policy priorities, and I'll continue to fight for a robust investment in these areas. So I look forward from hearing from our three excellent panelists on these issues, and I thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for calling attention to this issue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engel. So this morning we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel which includes Ms. Mary Ellen Iskandarian, and she's president and CEO of Women's World Banking, which is a nonprofit devoted to helping low-income women in developing countries access key financial tools and resources. And we have Dr. Tavneet Surrey, Associate Professor at MIT Sloan School of Management. She focuses on the impact of digital finance services in developing economies. And we have Ambassador Milan Verveer, who served as former Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues at the State Department, and she currently is the Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or any extraneous material for the record. And if we could ask everyone to summarize your remarks, that would be best, and then we'll go to the questions. So, Ms. Iskandarian, if you would like to start.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Mary Ellen Iskandarian, and I'm President and CEO of Women's World Banking. For nearly 40 years, we have listened to low-income women in developing countries describe their need for financial services and then worked with local banks, insurance companies, and increasingly cell phone companies to tailor convenient and affordable savings, insurance, and credit products to meet those needs. Women's World Banking currently works with 49 partners in 32 countries to reach 44 million clients. But Women's World Banking can't do this alone. The Global Findex tells us that 1.1 billion women, more than half of the world's unbanked population, do not have an account at a bank, while hundreds of millions more do not have access to the full set of financial products. In addition, women own roughly 1/3 of the 200 million businesses in emerging economies that have no or insufficient access to credit. Providing these women with basic financial services, that fundamental first step toward economic empowerment, can unlock unprecedented economic growth and job creation, and can have a direct impact on development outcomes such as health, education, food security, and water and sanitation. Women spend, save, and invest money in profoundly different ways than men. One such difference: when women have discretion over their financial choices, they prioritize spending on their families. On average, women spend 90 cents out of every dollar earned on education, healthcare, and housing, in comparison to men's 60 cents. Improving a woman's financial access brings with it a multiplier effect that will be critical to realizing the potential of financial inclusion for reducing poverty and driving economic growth. I'm pleased to note that you've entitled this hearing Beyond Microfinance. The traditional microfinance institutions established an important principle. Low-income people, and women in particular, can borrow responsibly. But over the years, we've learned that, like all of us, low-income people have complicated financial lives that require more than just a one-size-fits-all microloan. Fortunately, a broad range of providers, including mainstream commercial banks and insurance companies, as well as payments providers, mobile network operators, and fintech companies, has emerged to meet these needs. Yet low-income women face a number of barriers that hinder their access to these services. I'll touch briefly on just 3 of them, along with some potential solutions. First, millions of women lack the documentation and other forms of identification to open even a simple savings account. India has recently implemented an innovative biometric ID system that has dramatically expanded access to financial services. Elsewhere, tiered Know Your Customer requirements allow women to open no-frills savings accounts with minimal documentation. The second barrier women face is a lack of collateral. Women generally have fewer assets to pledge to a bank, and in many countries are legally barred from owning or inheriting land. In response, some countries have established movable collateral registries that better reflect the types of assets women can provide to satisfy bank requirements. Finally, more than 1.7 billion women in low and middle income countries do not even own a cell phone. This lack of access to technology, combined with lower financial and digital literacy, prevents them from fully utilizing digital financial services. Once women gain access to their own phones and some basic training, however, their usage levels parallel men's. Despite these barriers, I'm optimistic about the opportunities presented by women's financial inclusion. The United States can play an important role in accelerating those opportunities by joining other developed countries that are investing in women's financial inclusion. often led by their country's gender ambassadors. The United States can use its influence at the G20 and other fora to push for implementation of more national financial inclusion strategies that have explicit gender targets. USAID, OPIC, and even EXIM could catalyze more private sector investment by including requirements in their programs to serve women. They could also engage in public-private partnerships that serve to de-risk private sector investment. Distinguished committee members, thank you for calling attention to the role that women's financial inclusion plays in building stronger families, communities, and economies.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and members of the committee for hosting this hearing and giving me the opportunity to provide testimony on empowering women in the developing world. I would like to offer three main messages today. First, although there has been truly remarkable progress in alleviating global poverty across the world, the progress of women has not kept up with that of men. We have a long way to go towards gender equality in the developing world. For example, only 39% of the total workforce is female. Only 38% of businesses are female-owned, even in part. Second, all that said, it turns out that a number of private sector digital financial technologies are helping even poor women in remote areas join the economy and manage their money more effectively, with profound effects on their economic status and empowerment. Third, to date, though the private sector has created and provided these tools at scale, international aid played a critical role. In this case, millions of digital transactions each day in poor countries can be traced back to a small decision by the UK's International Development Agency to fund a pilot of a new idea. Good data-driven thinking, which brings together government and private sector innovations, can bring big payoffs. This hearing is aptly titled Beyond Microfinance. For many years, microfinance was thought to be key to lifting poor women out of poverty. We now have very strong evidence from 7 different countries showing that it simply does not. There is now a consensus amongst economists that this method, putting poor people into debt, is not an effective long-term poverty solution. But there are new findings suggesting that another area of finance does empower women: mobile money. In the US, services like Venmo or Apple Pay are just taking off. So it may be surprising to hear that Kenya's mobile money system, M-Pesa, has been around for 10 years. It lets people send money to one another with just a text message, so it works even on the simplest mobile phone. And this technology has taken the developing world by storm. There are twice as many mobile money payments every day as there are PayPal ones. There are over 400 million accounts in the developing world, more than half of these in sub-Saharan Africa alone. With my colleague Billy Jack at Georgetown, over the past 8 years, I've been studying what happened to communities in Kenya as M-Pesa spread across the country. The first thing we saw was how families deal with financial emergencies. The poor are never more than one emergency away from financial disaster. When a child gets sick, you'll do whatever you have to help them get better. The same holds for Kenyans. But in many families, this meant reducing the amount of food, other basic necessities, or even pulling their kids out of school to be able to pay for medicine. When M-Pesa arrived, families could now phone a friend for help. They could get money from a cousin across the country or a friend in the city. Then in turn, when that friend had an emergency, they'd repay the favor. A few years later, we looked at the broader impact of mobile money. When M-Pesa came to an area, it reduced poverty. It lifted an estimated 194,000 households, 2% of Kenyan households, out of extreme poverty. When we dug deeper, we found something we're not used to seeing. The anti-poverty effects were much stronger for women. In fact, an estimated 186,000 women in Kenya were able to switch from subsistence farming into business and sales occupations. Just giving women more privacy, flexibility, control, and the ability to manage the kinds of financial risks they face seems to have been a massive economic boon to them. And all that from a simple technology. Remember, it doesn't give people cows or loans or any entrepreneurial savvy they didn't have before. Our results on women's empowerment are now supported by fresh-off-the-presses work showing that cash grants have effects on male-run businesses and not on female-run businesses. But this is in part because even when women are given cash, often their husbands control where it goes. And in India, making government welfare payments electronic and giving women control of those payments by depositing the cash in their bank accounts improved their economic outcomes. One key message from the M-Pesa story is how it started. An idea of 2 employees at the private cell phone company Vodafone in the UK, a pilot paid for by the UK's equivalent of USAID, and a resulting scalable, highly profitable business model. There is essentially no private sector R&D in developing countries, and aid money here acted as crucial R&D capital for the firm. Supporting these sorts of digital innovations and technologies will be key to closing the gender gap in economic opportunities in the developing world. Thank you again for having me, and I'll look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you. Ambassador Verveer.
Chairman Royce and Congressman Engel and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today on an issue of critical importance, increasing women's economic participation and empowerment in developing nations. Mr. Chairman, let me begin by thanking you for your leadership in focusing on global women's issues. They are in the vital interest of the United States. Countries with declining living standards and inequality are more unstable and pose greater challenges to our own interests and our own security. Empowering women and girls is fundamentally a moral issue, a human rights issue. It is also smart and it is strategic. It advances our foreign policy as it tackles some of the most pressing issues that confront the globe and America's leadership. This hearing has to do with one of the great challenges worldwide. How do we grow economies, create jobs, and ensure inclusive prosperity? Today, there is a growing body of empirical evidence demonstrating the positive impact of investing in women and girls, from the World Bank to the World Economic Forum, from countless think tanks and private sector analysts. We know that women represent one of the most powerful economic opportunities the world has ever seen. The McKinsey Global Parity Report found that closing the global gender gap could drive more than $12 trillion in growth by 2025 if, and this is a big if, much more is done to tackle the obstacles that continue to hold women back. Microenterprise development has played an important role in lifting up women at the bottom of the pyramid. However, for them to grow out of their subsistence businesses is not easy. As you've heard, credit is not enough. An intensive package of high-potential interventions is required. Studies show that women-run SMEs are accelerators of economic growth. SMEs occupy that critical space in economies where jobs are created and economies grow. Yet if women are to unleash their potential, we must confront and reduce the barriers they confront. They face greater roadblocks than their male counterparts in starting and expanding businesses. Discriminatory laws and customs impede women's efforts. Violence against women is a global scourge. In some places, women have no rights to inheritance nor property, and very little in the way of legal protection. Women often lack training, mentors, networks, access to technology, markets, and access to finance, as you've heard, is particularly challenging. For female entrepreneurs to unleash their potential, addressing these obstacles will be essential. Women are also vital to the agriculture sector, and in many developing countries, they are the backbone of their economies. Yet subsistence-level women farmers do not have equal access to the resources which limit their productivity. A seminal FAO report showed that when women farmers can operate on a level playing field, including having land ownership, they can increase their individual yield success significantly. Technology has the potential to revolutionize women's lives in the developing world by providing critical access to information, mitigating health and safety risks, creating opportunity for financial security and independence. Yet mobile technology, as essential a tool as it is still out of reach for many poor women. Its greatest impact will be in mobile banking, which enables women to make the financial transactions that they need and to keep their money safe. But the genuine good news here is that strides are being made in digital financial services that are indeed transforming women's lives. The challenge we are addressing today is multifaceted, as must be any solution. No one investment constitutes a silver bullet. Many development investments are interrelated. Programs like women's health, education, freedom from violence, and legal rights are critically important to economic empowerment. And a federal budget that drastically cuts these programs will only shortchange women, but not only the women around the world, it will also shortchange the interests of the United States. I hope that the committee will also urge the administration to fill the position of Ambassador for Global Issues for the reasons that I've laid out in my testimony. Today, some of the largest and most far-sighted companies understand that engaging in partnerships to advance women brings benefits both to society and to companies themselves. Public-private partnerships recognize that no one sector has the monopoly on competencies that are required in this field, nor the resources, but together much can be achieved. And I lay out ways that companies today are engaged in these partnerships through value chain sourcing, digitizing financial services, and so much more. The United States should continue to catalyze, support, and participate in impactful and innovative partnerships among many stakeholders. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I thank the panelists. And when we look at, your testimony, there are a lot of things that jump out that are really quite surprising. And Dr. Surrey, you mentioned your research on mobile phones in Kenya. I think, again, what you just said was 186,000 women made the decision as a result of this new form of employment to move from subsistence farming to move into business or to move into sales. And yet, maybe you didn't see the same changes with men, but you saw this enormous shift. I think this is key, but could you explain maybe a little more of why you think this occurred?
Thank you, Chairman Royce. So that's exactly right. We did not see men shift occupational choice or switch their kind of decision of where their income is coming from, but women did, and that number's correct, 186,000. So we can't pinpoint exactly why, but we can tell you kind of the two sort of leading hypotheses, which are supported by the other work that was in my testimony. So one of them is that what M-Pesa or mobile money did was provide extra resilience. So you might have heard the term higher risk, higher return. Women weren't taking advantages of higher risk, higher return because they were worried about the downside risk. They were worried that if something goes wrong, I still need to feed my kids, educate my kids. And so when mobile money came along and gave them this protection from their social network, they were able to take advantage of these higher risk, higher return opportunities like a business, like sales. So I think that's part of the story. I think the other part of the story is it gives them control. A lot of these women actually do have cell phones, and they're able to save on their phones through mobile money, and it gives them a sense of access and control to what's on their phone. And so I think both of those components probably explain these findings for women.
So they exert ownership, or they exert control
Absolutely.
over what is one's property.
Absolutely.
And that's something that men maybe already have, but now that women are empowered in that way, they basically have a secure property right here, and that lets them assume greater risk, as you said, which
Correct.
is the driver of innovation, driver of economic growth.
Yeah, I like what you said when you opened. You said something about women controlling their future.
Yeah.
I think this allows women to control a bit more of their future.
Another question here, and I'll ask the panel, but developing countries are increasingly coming to recognize the importance of women's economic inclusion. So we see countries from Jordan to Kenya, as you pointed out, to Nicaragua. They've reformed their laws in recent years to improve women's property rights, but this change takes time. And we have, a Millennium Challenge Corporation here in our diplomacy that we use for leverage. And we've had some success in encouraging reforms in exchange for U.S. investment. And I would just ask the members of the panel here, how can we encourage more reforms, and what should we be focusing on in that effort? Ambassador.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, Mr. Chairman, and it is true that without the kinds of reforms and legal protection, women are not able to progress as they might in the economic sphere. I think what the MCC has done over a longer-term trajectory, as it's organized to do, it certainly has a very strong gender component to its work, and also is holding governments using the leverage of America's investment, as you say. I think the private sector, too. Mobile companies, for example, who go in to ask for expansions of regulatory opportunities could also be raising issues about women's legal protections or ways in which women can enhance their standing. So I think we need a combination of people who talk to governments, as each and every one of you does when you are on a CODEL or when they're coming here, to raise these issues. You know, we talk about them as women's issues, but they are far more than women's issues. They peculiarly affect women, there's no doubt about it. But they have a great deal to say about all of society and certainly how economies function. So I think we should not diminish the aggregation of all of the ways to influence governments in making the right decisions.
And I wanted to ask Ms. Iskandarian this question, too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to build on Ambassador Vivier's comments, it's a bit of a hackneyed phrase, but what gets measured gets done. And I think one thing that MCC in particular, but certainly any other agencies that are interacting with our nations abroad and developing countries can insist that tracking the data, tracking the number of women that are being served is done. Only 34% of cell phone companies today that are offering mobile money services even know the gender of their clients. So we can't even really assess the full nature of the problem until we actually know who's being served, who's not being served, and how they may be different. We saw, both of the panelists referred to this, huge improvements in financial inclusion between 2011 and 2014 in the run-up to the Global Findex report. The biggest changes were in those countries that had specific national financial inclusion strategies that had specific gender targets. That would be such an easy thing for us to include in anything that we require of a government that we're providing funding to.
Very good. My time's expired. Mr. Engel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Verveer, let me ask you this. Thank you again for coming here. And I have two questions. While empowering women economically is certainly aligned with America's values, it's also in America's U.S. national security and foreign policy interests because it promotes peace and stability in fragile states. And you've done a lot of work in Georgetown, and during your time at the State Department as the first U.S. ambassador on global women's issues, on the link between women's economic empowerment and national security. So I would ask you, in general, how does empowering women promote U.S. foreign policy, national security, and economic interests? And what role did empowering women economically have in Rwanda in terms of economic growth, but also post-conflict peace and stability?
Congressman Engel, I think the connectivity between women's economic agency and participation and peace and security is one that is increasingly linked and one that we are recognizing as critically important. And I know that this panel had a previous hearing in this whole area of women, peace, and security and what their agency represent. We know that in those societies where the condition of women is one where they are oppressed and denied their rights, those conditions often are the first signs of increased instability and potential conflict. And I often feel as though women are the canaries in the mines. Look at what's happening to the women, and you will have a sense of what is to come down the pike if we have the vision and the ability to look at those conditions and take them seriously. I think one of the most important elements as we take hopefulness out of situations where countries are coming out of conflict is to appreciate that you can have the best peace agreement, but if the key issues that affect the people on the ground, and one of the critical ones is their economic future, are not weighed into those agreements and then are not executed in a recovery process, you're not going to have that long-term sustainable peace that an agreement hopefully would guarantee. And in a place like Rwanda, for example, there was a recognition, and while so many lives were lost, that women had to play a critical role. Today, they comprise some 60% of their parliament, the highest women's participation in legislatures in the world. They are active in ministries. They are active in every facet of the decision-making processes in Rwanda. And I think, to some extent, whatever you think of President Kagame, he has recognized that the empowerment of women has played a major difference in moving his country forward. In my testimony, I note one of the projects that I've been involved in that included a private sector company, Kate Spade and Company, which made a business investment in Rwanda specifically for business results, but also to empower women. And what we've seen in the case studies that have been done on that investment is what a difference it is making, not only in terms of their business investment, but particularly in terms of women's economic empowerment and social progress for those women and their community. So again, the link between economic participation, economic viability, opportunity, and sustainable peace and the amelioration of conflict and the avoidance of conflict go absolutely hand in hand.
Thank you. Let me ask Mrs. Kandarian this question. What steps do you believe that the administration should take to promote the economic empowerment of women? How and why should they target women from poor rural communities just as equally as those living in urban centers that already have access to the formal economy or banking? And finally, what good does incentivizing legal and policy reform do for women from all socioeconomic backgrounds?
That's a tall order. I think
and you have 18 seconds.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think just to make one clarifying point, that urban-rural divide that you mentioned, yes, one of the very exciting things about mobile money is that we are able to reach rural populations that are so much, that have been so excluded. But just because a woman is in an urban area doesn't necessarily mean that she has access to financial services. In far too many places, we still see the formal financial sector has, for example, very, very high minimum balance requirements, for example. There is a very strong sentiment on the part of low-income men and women that the financial sector doesn't really want them. But I think for women, there's also this emotional distance, so to speak, that they really do not feel respected. Their savings are not necessarily wanted. But those banks that do make that commitment, that do make that leap into this new market, find that women are really excellent clients. They tend to be the savers. Their savings accounts are the stickier savers. They are more willing to buy cross-sold products than men are. They buy more insurance than men do. Lots of very good benefits. And so I think to whatever extent this administration can continue to foster that support specifically from the private sector. And as I mentioned in my remarks, I think there is a great deal we can do in de-risking. We've seen a number of the development finance institutions from other developed countries are providing that kind of support, first loss guarantees, that first step into a market that supports a private sector player, but then as they get used to that market, they see that this is a good form of investment, that support can be lessened.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, before I go back, I just ask for unanimous consent to enter CARE's written testimony into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We go now to Ileana Ros-Lehtinen of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for convening this important hearing, and thanks to our witnesses for excellent testimony. With so much going on around the world, the Syria conflict, the Iranian nuclear deal, North Korea's ballistic missiles, and everything in between, lamentably, we often overlook the plight of women in the developing world and our role and our responsibility for helping these women. We know that women in many developing countries oftentimes face insurmountable legal, cultural, and religious barriers to becoming the full and equal members of society that must be their natural right. Not only is this a travesty for the rights of women, but in many of these countries, when women have the same rights and access as men, the transition from developing to developed countries becomes a reality. Preventing half of your population from access to the job market and thus the financial tools to help promote economic growth is just unconscionable. It is imperative that we discuss ways to correct this and that women in developing countries have access to the tools and the services so they can have an important role in their countries. We must also remember that it isn't just the economy to which they are being denied access. It starts from the time that they are children. Oftentimes, women are not even registered at birth, putting their future and their well-being in danger. That is why I've always been proud to support my good friend Steve Shabbat in his efforts to pass the Girls Count Act, and thank you, Steve, for that, to ensure that these girls get birth certificates and are registered. My goodness, as a former Florida certified teacher, I know how important education is to all children. But for women in developing countries, before we talk about getting them access to financial tools, we really need to ensure that they have access to a real education. That's why I've authored bills to provide Pakistani girls and women access to scholarships so they can get the education they require, and why I'm co-sponsoring Steve's Preventing Girls' Access to Education Act. For women in developing countries, we need to start changing the fundamental ways in which they are viewed from the moment they are born if we're ever going to have a chance at their access to the financial services later on. And that's a tall task because of the legal and cultural barriers they often face. Women in about 18 of the world's economies, unfortunately, including many in the subcommittee that Mr. Deutsch and I head, the Middle East and North Africa subcommittee, require permission from their husbands or legal male guardians to work outside of the home, if they're even allowed to work at all. So I would ask the panel, how do you begin to make a change when so much discrimination is ingrained in the cultural norms and the societal norms and the values, when women from the time of birth are not viewed as equal to men? And how can we in the United States leverage our assistance and our role in the global stage effectively enough to promote the change that is needed? Thank you. Ambassador.
Well, Congresswoman, thank you for those remarks and for your leadership. It is not all a dismal story. There is certainly a long road to climb and a journey that women are on all over the world, but there has indeed been progress, and a lot of the progress has come out of the leadership of our diplomatic and development efforts, as well as certainly those of others. And I think one of the key issues you mentioned is education. It is absolutely fundamental for a girl to be educated. Malala took a bullet just to make the case that girls have a right to an education. It is that mega change component because we know all of the things that come out of an educated girl in terms of the benefits that take place over her lifetime, the children she raises, the kind of job she has.
Thank you, Ambassador. Any of the other two? Thank you, Dr. Surrey.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I guess I would say I think there's two parts of this. Education, I completely agree. I think that's also tied to financial inclusion. We've got some work in Kenya showing that when we gave households access to loans for these water tanks where you can store water, the girls went back to school. So kind of understanding not just kind of what's, not just attitudes, but what is actually preventing the girls from going to school, what are they doing, and how do we try to alleviate those constraints can be important. I also want to mention some work on India, which is fascinating, where they required required some districts to have a third of women participation in local government. And they looked at the decisions then that the women made versus the men. And the women, of course, have different preferences than men. They chose different public goods and different investments than the men. Hard to weigh up which ones are better or worse. But what was really fascinating is they also did some surveys on the ground of people, and they saw that people's views of women started to change when women started to participate in local government and they saw women making decisions about what the community needed or not. So I
Thank you
think
very much.
that is also something.
And sorry we ran out of time, but next time. Thank you, Chairman Royce, and thank you, Mr. Engel, for convening this important hearing. And thank you to Lois Frankel. I know that she was one of the engines behind this hearing. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Ileana. Albio Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and I always been very interested in this topic. I grew up in a household where machismo was it. My father would not allow my brother and I to hang around the kitchen. And I still remember the day when I was helping my mother make the bed where he picked me up and he spanked me because I was helping my mother. He always said that was the woman's domain. But a funny thing happened along the way. At the age of 11, my parents and I and my brother, we came to America. My mother got a job first. All of a sudden, things changed in the house so completely. My father was in the kitchen helping her because she came in late. My father was helping out with the wash, which was to me, and I always used to tell my father, I said, whatever happened to all those things that you taught me in Cuba that I shouldn't do? And I think he was kind of embarrassed by the way things changed. And later on, he got a job, and all those things went down the tubes. I also remember my first day teaching. I taught in a school with a lot of Hispanic students, and since I was bilingual, I was a chaperone at the school dances. And the principal said, you have to come. And I used to hang around in a corner with about 12 mothers who used to come to the high school dances. So when you say to me that, I mean, it's fascinating, the whole, and I fortunately had two great college professors. I went to a Jesuit school in New Jersey, which was only men, but when I got there, it had changed, and I had the first professor, the woman professor ever, and the second woman professor. They were fascinating, and this topic was always brought up. But I cannot agree with you more that education and economic opportunity changes the whole formula. And I think that's what we should strive for when we want to help somebody. There are a lot of things that we can do, but I think education and certainly economic opportunity, because I saw that my mother brought the first check, and the whole thing changed, overnight. And to this day, I find the whole thing fascinating. So I guess what can we do to continue to provide economic opportunity for women? Because I think that's the only way that you're going to be able to change it. And obviously education also. Especially in the Western Hemisphere, I think that's still pretty much, machismo is still pretty much alive in the Western Hemisphere in all these countries. Because I see, my district is obviously a very predominant Hispanic district I represent just about every country in the Western Hemisphere that speaks Spanish. And I hear these stories. So, and I'm concerned with some of these cuts that, for these programs for women, how we're going to impact that in the Western Hemisphere. So can you, sorry it takes so much time, but can you talk a little bit about it? We'll start with you.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for that story. It's absolutely what we see on the ground. As soon as the financial situation shifts a little bit, the dynamic in the household changes, a lot of other things can change as well. I think I just would like to build on some of what we were talking about with education, because what we see far too often is some of that really fantastic benefit that we all know about educating girls get lost if we also don't prepare them financially. So in part of that education, giving them financial literacy skills, and what we're seeing in our work on the ground, also getting a savings account, ideally in their own names, as early as possible. We've been working with an NGO in Africa that's graduating, 180,000, 200,000 young girls from secondary school every year. Tremendous progress. But they're seeing those girls married within a year because they don't have savings, they don't have life skills, they're not financially prepared to go out in the world.
I always figured that one of the issues that held my mother back was that. My mother was 13 and my father was 23 when they started going out. I always told my father, you're going to be put in jail in America if you did that. Can you?
Yes, thank you, Congressman. I guess I'll just add on some of the stuff that was said earlier, and something that Mrs. Kandarian talked about. If you look at the mobile money story, the technology and the innovation was seeded by aid money, by a donor. It allowed the private sector to kind of de-risk what they were doing and provide a set of tools that affect women. I think thinking through how we provide that R&D capital for the private sector and emerging economies is really important because they don't have R&D. They don't do R&D traditionally. But if we can de-risk private sector investments in these countries, I think we can get a whole set of new technologies and tools to women that I think will really benefit them.
I'm sorry I ran out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to point out that the leadership, Mr. Engel and Mr. Royce, have again demonstrated that there's a lot of areas that we can work together on, and that we are choosing issues like this that are just somewhat out of the ordinary. And so I want to thank the leadership for this hearing today and making this issue. I'd like some more specifics from you. You're the experts, and I want to know what countries are the good guys and what countries are the bad guys. And I guess, first of all, what countries would you say are on the super good guy list, and what are the countries that are on the super bad guys list?
Well, I think, I don't know if I'd call them the good guys and the bad guys necessarily, but there are plenty of rankings today, Congressman. And whether it's the UNDP's Human Development Rankings or the World Economic Forum's Gender Gap Rankings.
Okay.
Take the World Economic Forum. Nobody accuses them of being a women's organization. And yet they annually look at the gender gap between men and women on 4 metrics in any given country: health, access to education, economic participation, and political participation.
Okay.
And when you look at those rankings, the Scandinavian countries and others are at the top, and then keep going down, and you find a lot of the countries that are in the most difficult straits today, conflict-ridden, poverty-stricken, capturing the headlines and not the most favorable way, are the places where gender equality is clearly at the bottom.
So are there any poor countries? We're saying poor countries versus rich countries then. Are there any poor countries that have a really good record on this?
It's not, and that's a very good point, because if you look at the WEF's rankings, you'll find some anomalies in there. Countries perhaps in Latin America and Central America or in Africa, because they're looking at the gap based on what they have. And as they're closing the gap within the context of that country, they are making progress.
Okay, give me some specifics.
I don't have the rankings in front of me, unfortunately.
So who are the good guys? Okay, there's some good guys at the lower end of the scale, a lot of bad guys. And one of the reasons that their countries are poor is because they have oppressed women. And I think that it's very clear that if you oppress women, you're oppressing 1/2 of your population, and thus you're cutting yourself off from a lot of economic activity. But do you have some names for me?
Well, several years ago, the Arab Development Report was published, and it has been since updated by Arab intellectuals. Wrote that report. It had not inconsiderable impact in the region because one of the clear indices of why they were not progressing economically in ways that they should was the state of women's conditions.
Sure.
Lack of education.
I understand. I'm trying to get less philosophy out of you than some more specifics. I understand.
Well, I'm talking about the region.
Okay, give me some names of countries. We don't have any names of countries? Give me a name of a couple of bad guys we should have on our list say, hey, why do you
Well,
treat
look
women
at
that
the
way in your
situation in
country?
Pakistan, for example.
Okay, Pakistan.
Or the situation in Yemen. You know,
Okay.
these, and then look at the state of those countries. Certainly at the bottom in terms of equal opportunity and
Thank you. That's what I was really looking for. Pakistan and Yemen, of course, let's keep that in mind when we're dealing with those countries. By the way, let me just note that women's role in the military in various places, the Kurds and the Israelis seem to have women playing a major role in the security of their country. Are there countries, other countries like that, that the United States has really increased the role of women in our military, and who are the good guys and bad guys in terms of utilizing women within their government and their military?
you've raised another critically important issue, the participation of women in the security sector. I think there are some 7 or 8 ministers of defense now in the European countries who are really moving this agenda forward. As you mentioned, we are making some progress. It is still a significant problem in UN peacekeepers, for example. There are very few women in the ranks of peacekeepers, yet major part of their mission is the protection of civilians, and it's often women who are in the most difficult straits in the places where they're keeping the peace. In military service and in police service, whether it's in Afghanistan or other places of conflict, to raise the participation
Well,
of
let's
women.
just note, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and we note that here on Capitol Hill, it was a female police officer that saved the lives of several members of Congress who were under attack. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. Ami Bera of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I was listening to my colleague Albio Surrey's talk about his upbringing. When I think about my own upbringing in an immigrant household, both my parents worked, but my mom had multiple jobs, making sure me and my 2 older brothers got ready for school, making sure that we had something to eat, making sure that we did our homework, and the importance of empowering women to be kind of that glue. I guess I'd like to ask a couple questions. I think Ms. Iskandarian, you talked a little bit about kind of going cashless, and India is doing a pretty interesting experiment right now, and maybe it's not an experiment. It actually seems to be going fairly well, and I'd be curious about the thoughts of going to this cashless economy and digital economy, and the impact on that has, both bringing women but bringing everyone into the traditional economy. So if you
Yeah, it's truly remarkable, Congressman, what India has been able to accomplish, and the government has really just driven financial inclusion. They have, as I mentioned in my remarks, instituted this biometric system. So everybody has a thumbprint, and that's been available to men and women alike. There are some things that we love to see changed in this, because when the government is then looking at financial inclusion, they're looking at household financial inclusion. And so we don't always know, but when we dig into the data, that typically means that the husband has taken that biometric information and opened a bank account rather than than the wife. But not in all cases, and we're very excited about the opportunities. You probably heard recently about the demonetization. Right. India took several currency notes out of the system. It was particularly difficult for women who still were operating in cash and didn't necessarily have access to the technology for a variety of reasons, including cultural and social reasons. They didn't own the cell phone. So we're eager to make sure that women are not left behind in this exciting move towards the cashless economy.
Dr. Surrey, did you want to add?
Yeah, I'm happy to add, and thank you for that question. I'll mention a couple of things on the digitization in India, which, like Mrs. Kendarian said, has been impressive. When they started off, I really didn't think they'd succeed at giving most of their population a digital identity. I think there's a bunch of research now showing great gains to this. One has been, as they digitized people's identity, they digitized a bunch of the social welfare programs from the government. And this has dramatically reduced corruption in the government because you can't have fake people anymore in the system, and I can't sign up Mrs. Skandarian and just pay her on the side. So you see a reduction in corruption. And then accompanying that, we've seen some work where when women earn the money off the workfare programs, if it's tied to a bank account that they have, that is theirs, it increases their labor force participation and their earnings. So I think it can't be just digitization on its own, because as Ms. Skandarian said, that doesn't mean necessarily financial inclusion in the way we think about it for women and financial use. But when I can tie that digitization to now financial tools and other things, then you do see this benefit for women.
Ambassador.
Thanks, Congressman. You know, one of the things that has always affected me is traveling throughout the developing world is how terrified women are that the meager earnings that they may have will not be safely kept because either it will be taken from them within their household or through bribes of one kind or another that they have to pay for essential needs. And this overriding concern is something that I think these changes that we're talking about this morning begin to really address in a serious way. And I think today you see more and more of the governments, as Dr. Surrey said, taking their welfare payments, many of them projected to the woman, targeted to the woman for education and health and essential needs of her children. And increasingly, that's coming in a card. It's digitized in a card. So the cash is gone. She can't be targeted in the way she's used to being targeted and vulnerable. The corruption, as Dr. Surrey said, begins to be addressed, and that's a serious problem everywhere, as we know. And she goes with that card to get what those essential items that she needs for her family. So this is revolutionizing that great fear that most poor women have in keeping their earnings safe.
Great, fantastic. I yield back.
We go now to Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. This really has been fascinating to hear the cell phone use in Kenya. That was how incredible, how positive. And Dr. Surrey, the House of Representatives, with the bipartisan leadership of Chairman Ed Royce and Ranking Member Eliot Engel, has a long history of promoting women's economic empowerment in developing countries through various pieces of legislation, including funding for micro-enterprise development programs focused on women entrepreneurs, and last Congress's Global Food Security Act, which supported improved property rights and technical assistance for female farmers. In a time of limited resources, where should we be focusing our efforts now? Where can we get the best return on our investment?
Great. Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I think I would echo something Mrs. Skandarian said earlier, and something I've said already. One is measurement, 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 measurement. We're still figuring out what works effectively and what works best. And I think trying to encourage measurement. You know, we talked about property rights and how people have changed laws around property rights. Changing laws isn't enough because it might not actually be implemented, right? And so understanding whether those laws have actually trickled down to changing women's rights for inheritance is important. I don't think we have an answer to that. So I would say measurement is really important. Evaluation, understanding what works, and then investing in the things that work is really important. And this ties back to what I was saying earlier. There's not a lot of R&D capital type stuff in these countries. And so trying to be the provider of the risk, sort of the risk investment and the measurement kind of, let's figure out what works and then invest in that, allows us to kind of use that capital very effectively, and then the private sector can build on sort of the things we're finding. So that's where I would see it.
And we would look forward to each of you on any legislation that we pass for your advice on what we can do better. A side issue is that I've seen other organizations like the International Association of Credit Unions. I was president in, of all places, in Novosibirsk in Siberia, and it was so encouraging to me to see the establishment of credit unions where microloans were made to women to sell cosmetics door to door. At that time in the late 1990s that was utterly revolutionary in post-Soviet Russian Federation. So over and over, so much can be done. And Ms. Eskandarian, widespread lack of official identification in developing countries disproportionately affects women and girls, without which it is hard for them to obtain even basic services such as a bank account. This committee has passed legislation, the Girls Count Act, to promote birth registration for girls in developing countries, but for these women who do not have a birth certificate or other official identification, what are some of the new technologies that are helping them to gain access to important financial tools?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman, and thank you very much to the committee for having supported that legislation. The lack of a birth certificate, just stops a woman's progress right out of the gate, literally. So as we were referring earlier, the biometric identification tool is very, very exciting, and we're excited that there's going to be, sort of further South-South cooperation. India is now sort of going on the road with their technology. We do quite a bit of work in Nigeria where they've got a similar technology, but where India has literally a palm-sized piece of technology that they can take out into the field and get the fingerprint. In Nigeria, the machine is like the size of this table. So getting the technology right, even with that great idea, is absolutely critical. As I also mentioned in my remarks, something as simple, that's really not a technology, but something as simple as reducing know your customer requirements for somebody to open a bank account with a cell phone photo, basic identification, not, in Nigeria, there's a 150-page questionnaire that you have to fill out regardless of what you're trying to do with that bank account. When they instituted Know Your Customer requirements that were tiered to open simple savings accounts, you not only saw financial inclusion dramatically increase, but you saw the banks, the private sector banks going in. It was now affordable for them to serve these customers because they didn't have those heavy documentary requirements.
And thank you for highlighting where it's working and also suggesting changes where I think certainly technology could be better. Thank you, and my time is up. And again, thank you so much for all of you being here today.
Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Ross and Mr. Engel, for this hearing today. Terrific. Thank you to all of you, and thank you for all your work. I'm going to assume that you all agree that the President needs to fill this position of Ambassador of Global Women's Issues as soon as possible. That's something you all agree on? Yes? Okay. So, yes, you're all shaking your head yes. And Representative Torres asked me to associate herself with some of these remarks that I'm going to make and some of these questions. Thank you for your talking about trying to connect women to technology and their cell phones. But I think you would all agree that a cell phone is not a replacement for an IUD or a birth control pill, access to health care. It can help, I guess, get you the money, right? And that's what I want. A couple points that I would like you to touch on here is for women to be productive, they cannot just be reproductive, correct? Yet we've seen this administration expanding the global gag rule, zeroing out funding for family planning, cutting off funding for the UN Population Fund. And listen, I'm not just talking about abortion, okay? That's controversial. Let's just talk about someone being able to plan their families. I'd like you to touch on the impact of women not having full access to health care and being able to plan her own families, how that affects them economically. And the second thing I would like you to touch on is we've heard some talk about a new World Bank fund. We are giving $50 million to it. I'd like you to relate that to a women's fund. Yeah, I'd like you to relate, if you can, that to your discussion.
Well, thank you, Congresswoman. I couldn't say it better in terms of the critical nature of how these investments in women are interrelated. You think of any American woman If she doesn't have access to family planning, for example, if she voluntarily wants access to family planning, to be able to conduct her life, take care of her children, give them the best that she can provide, and succeed in her work, then she's constrained. She's severely constrained. A poor woman's problem is that much more greater. I have been in so many settings where women had one woman I remember vividly, 5 girls, 5 boys. She said to me, "This is too many children. I can't take care of them. I don't know what's going to happen to them. We have nothing." It is so significantly entwined with their futures, with their economic viability, with how they take care of their families. You can't work if you're sick. You can't work if you're so constrained. So that goes without saying as far as I'm concerned. In terms of the Women's Entrepreneurship Initiative that Ivanka Trump's been associated with, and that is part of this World Bank partnership, I think, it's a good thing. It provides loan guarantees, which we have seen work significantly. Ms. Eskandarian has talked about ameliorating risks, for example. Banks will not make these loans to women, small businesses or medium-sized businesses, unless frequently there's a guarantee that they won't lose everything on that loan. And this is supposed to, with the bank's work, involve training as well as other aspects of financial support and related supports. And there have been commitments from other governments as well. But the point is, that's a good initiative, but if in isolation we cut everything else, then what has it achieved? And I think that's what we have to keep in mind. We can't just do one thing and expect magical results. We need to understand the complete person in these cases, what she represents for her country, what is in our vital interests, and make decisions accordingly.
Thank you, Ms. Frankel. Thank you. We'll now turn to Mr. McCall of Texas, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here today, all three. And I remember several years ago reading a book called Inside the Kingdom, My Life in Saudi Arabia, written by Carmen bin Laden. She was a European woman who married into quite a family that everybody knows about today. But she talked about 1979 particularly, and how life was in the kingdom before the Ayatollah came into power in Iran and changed the entire region, and then how life was after that event in 1979. And we all know it changed Iran, but it also fundamentally changed the Arabian Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, really rolling back time as it pertained to women. And of course, the dress came back with the burqas, and women were no longer able to drive in the kingdom, and were not able to go outside only at certain times, couldn't go into certain premises, just highly restricted, very oppressive society. And it's very sad to think the direction it was going before 1979 and where it is today after 1979. I've had the opportunity to visit, as many members have, to Saudi Arabia, and I've seen that oppression. It's very dark, and I've seen that firsthand. I've seen that same oppression in Afghanistan, just a little different color of burqa. It's more of a beautiful blue color. Pakistan, as you mentioned, Yemen. It's a change in their laws, but more, I think, a change in their culture. And I guess my question, and it's a very basic one, is how do we change that? And how do we change that fundamental, culture so we can lift that oppressiveness off of these women? Ambassador?
Well, it's a very good question, Congressman, and I think it's a critically important question because we know that you need heat at the top. You've got to change laws. You've got to respect human rights. But you need heat at the bottom, and that comes from the people and their mindsets often. And the mindsets, whether it's what hobbyists and what they're perpetrating, or whether it's customarily saying this is how it is, it puts women down and really, in many ways, affects their human rights deeply. But there are a number of examples today where these norms, culture can change, but you've got to work at it. And you do need heat at the top, and you need heat at the bottom. And for example, this issue of female genital mutilation, FGM, it's a horrific custom that many women go through, because it's their future. If they don't, their future is inhibited in significant ways. But where there have been efforts, and they're documented, and there's successes every day, for the community to come together and understand what this does in terms of harming the health of the woman, potentially meaning maternal death in terms of childbirth, the consequences are huge. It takes village fathers, it takes imams, it takes the men, and then the community coming together. And in place after place, norms have changed. The norm went from FGM to the health of the woman. But it takes time, but we have to work at it. And education is a critical element in all of that.
And I know the young Saudi crown prince, who will be the king one day, has a more progressive point of view with respect to this, and with respect to the role of women in his society, and hopefully that will provide a change as well. Are there any other examples of a fundamental change in some of these countries that has made a difference in the lives of women? Perhaps the other two witnesses?
I would just, thank you very much for the question, Congressman. I just refer to some work that we're doing in Pakistan currently with a mobile cell phone company that's offering financial services. And we went in, actually, group of Western women feeling pretty, ambitious, or we didn't think we'd be able to really achieve very much. But the company was seeing real change in youth dynamics and the generational dynamics, that yes, it was difficult for unmarried girls to have access to cell phones. Fathers really were not comfortable with their girls having cell phones. But since so many of their husbands of slightly older women had grown up with phones, and they wanted their wives to have that access, we saw a real change and a real opportunity for...
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. McCall.
Thank you. And sometimes I have to ban cell phones from my teenage daughters every now and then.
And now we're pleased to turn to Ms. Congressman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the important work that you're doing, and for being here to really add to this important discussion today. I'd like to touch on a couple of things with regards to the use of mobile money and M-Pesa in Kenya, but how it is shown to be less effective in other countries. I think recently M-Pesa was shut down in Albania, affecting nearly 250,000 users. So if you can talk about what are some of the barriers that still exist, and how you recommend public-private partnerships to break through this. Why does it work in places like Kenya and not in places like Albania?
Sure, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. So I'll say a couple of things. One is, we're now seeing results out of Bangladesh that find the same sort of financial resilience effects we were finding, which is brand new work out of Bangladesh. Similar results in Tanzania, and we are replicating in Uganda, so in a few months I'll be able to tell you results for Uganda. I think one key component of mobile money and why it's worked in Kenya is actually the business model. They knew when they did this pilot that was funded by the British Aid Organization that people wanted to use this technology to send money across distances, right? The people who invented this thought it was for microloans. Oh, this will be a way for people to pay off loans. Turns out very few people have microloans in Kenya, and they didn't want it for that. They wanted it to send money 200 kilometers because there was no way to do that. And so they rebranded the product, number one. And number two, they realized, I can't just have my cash in, cash out points be in the city. if I have the money in the city, no one's ever going to use it. I need cash in, cash out points everywhere. So the private company invested in this network of agents to cash in, cash out, that when they started was already 4 or 5 times the size of the banking infrastructure. Today it's 130 times. A cash out agent is about half a kilometer, 5-10 minute walk from almost every Kenyan for the average Kenyan. So that business model of needing to be everywhere rather than in the cities was really, really key to this being successful. A lot of people who've copied it don't think through the business model. They think through the technology and say, oh, I can copy that technology, but they think, oh, I'm a banker, I'm going to start in the capital city and see how it goes before going anywhere. But if you do that, you're going to restrict the entire purpose of the technology. And so I think people haven't quite picked up on the business model is one, and how crucial that business model is to the success of what the technology is meant to do. And I think the UK aid pilot allowed them to realize that what we were thinking is wrong and we need to do something completely different. So that's one aspect. I think the other is kind of investing heavily in the platform that develops this technology. So talking about the risk investment is, I think, important here too. So those are the two, I think, big success cases. And then there are countries that are not allowing it regulation-wise. They're worried it's sort of outside the formal banking system, and what does this imply? And so I think there's been some agencies trying to take the Kenya example and regulators from Kenya around to talk to people to try and get them to understand what are the right sorts of regulations you need to have in place to avoid money laundering and to avoid the risks that you traditionally think of in the banking system.
And my next question was about collateral. I think a couple of you have mentioned that as one of the barriers for women in particular that has to be overcome with regards to property rights and other things. So if you could expand a little bit about how that barrier is being overcome.
Again, thank you very much for the question. As I mentioned in my remarks, we're very excited about this growing trend of movable collateral registries that we're seeing. 15 countries in Africa alone are going to have movable collateral registries coming online in the next 2 to 3 years. In China, when they implemented a movable collateral registry, they allowed accounts receivables, things that we take for granted in our banking system, to be used as security against a loan. We saw a massive increase in SME lending, 2/3 of which was to women. So being able to have access to other forms of security is really critical. We're also seeing some exciting fintech solutions where we're providing alternative credit scoring. The ability to track behavior, track payments, track interactions, transactions digitally is allowing us to have algorithms that do track to creditworthiness.
Yeah, I'll just add one bit. I think the other way to fix some of this is to provide loans that are for assets.
Right.
So some of the work we did in Kenya, we gave loans for a water tank, and some people can have cash, and like, no, it's for the asset, and the asset is the collateral.
Right.
And that allows them to get a loan for an asset, and then you can recollateralize that asset once it's paid off.
That's great.
And so I think that's another way to do it, is to say, let's do, mortgage-style lending. It's not a mortgage because that's a big amount, but even for, a $200 asset, let's structure it where the asset is collateral.
That's great.
And that allows you to then keep that collateral once it's paid off and recollateralize it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Gabbard. We turn to Congressman Scott Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, ladies, for being here. I'm fascinated to a certain extent, Dr. Surrey, by your story in Kenya. I've got 2 daughters, and I haven't been to Kenya. I've read, of course, and I can only imagine the culture, right? And how if the woman, even though she might have the money, if she has it physically, where the man might take it and control it, et cetera. So in the greater context, though, we're going to spend about $35 billion on foreign aid this year, right? The United States taxpayers are going to spend that. And I've got this study from the GAO regarding how the different agencies are doing, how they spend their money, and the efficacy, right, of the goals. It's a pretty sad. It's pretty sad. For instance, DOD, of the high quality, generally met all applicable criteria, 0. Now, yeah, in that context, it's DOD, right? I would contend that this should not be DOD's mission, right? But apparently people contend it is, and we've sent money to them, and they get pretty poor results. But even at the State Department, they're up to a whopping 4%. USAID does a little better at 26. Millennium Challenge Corporation, believe it or not, 44%. So I guess my question is, and one of you, I don't know if it was Ms. Iskandarian or Dr. Surrey, said if you measure it, that's the key. Well, somebody's measuring it here, but I don't know that we're making the changes that we need to based on the measurements. So for each of you, your top 3 policy recommendations for us policymakers to make a difference so that we change this, this zero to something meaningful. And if it means DOD doesn't spend any of this money and it's sent to the Millennium Challenge Corporation, so be it. But you are the alleged expert. You're here because of your expertise, right? So we're looking for some answers from you on how to do the job better than we're doing, which is apparently abysmal if you look at the GAO study. So anybody care to venture?
Well, I'll start. I think, given this hearing, one of the critical things in government that doesn't happen is to look at the gender influence, if you will, integrating gender into these issues. A lot of these issues aren't women's issues. So farming, agriculture, productivity. We know that women farmers, for example, often are the backbones of their economies, where they're ag economies, and often comprise the majority of the smallhold farmers. Yet when we have ag policies, do we integrate that consideration in terms of what women need as opposed to male farmers? Those are often different needs for productivity, that if we did bring those issues to the table in our consideration, we would have dramatically different results. And with food policy and food security issues, it's critically important to do that. And we've seen from the studies that have been done that where that is a major consideration, you have outcomes that are different.
That's fair.
Another one is
I want to be quick.
measuring and evaluation. And
Right.
it's data. We talk about data. It's the cat's meow. It's something we should all be doing, but we're not willing to pay for data collection. And I think that's a very big issue in a lot of the grants that are made and the decisions.
What else you got?
Another one is looking at the evidence-based case. What's working and what's not working, and quit repeating the mistakes and scale what is scalable.
So just in that point, we're going to need some help from outside organizations because, for instance, I'm going to tell you that when you go to cut some of the money going to DOD for these programs, can you imagine the panoply of names that we're all going to be called around here if we say 1 cent less for X? That's where we need your help to point out, look, this is not effective. It's nothing personal, but let's spend the money here. We'll do the same mission, but somebody else does a better job. Yes, ma'am.
So I would say 3 things. R&D, we do not do enough about learning what works and testing and experimenting. You know, the Poverty Action Lab that I'm affiliated with at MIT is doing this with policy. Let's go experiment and see what works. Think of the title of this hearing, Microfinance. We thought this was the silver bullet for women. Turns out it doesn't do that at all.
Right.
We have now 7 studies. So I think really doing what R&D would do, which doesn't exist in developing countries. Not just measure, but evaluate, test, experiment. I think working with the private sector. The private sector in developing countries is showing an ability to scale in a way that others don't have. Mobile money is scaling across the developing world faster than most things. And so seeding kind of innovation in the private sector, I think, can get you lots of gains.
I'm sorry, my time's expired. I'm happy to talk to you afterward. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now we're pleased to turn to Robin Kelly of Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for holding this hearing on empowering women in the developing world. This is a multifaceted issue that is particularly important to me. That's why Congressman Gabbard and I introduced H.R. 2408, the Protecting Girls' Access to Education in Vulnerable Settings Act. Giving women and girls access to quality education not only increases their economic potential, but is directly related to conflict prevention and reducing gender gaps. Already 1 in 5 girls in developing countries who enroll in primary schools never finish. And I'm concerned this Trump budget, unfortunately, will drive more women and girls out of school as a result of of very concerning cuts to foreign aid. USAID found that when 10% more girls go to school, a country's GDP increases on average by 3%. Education provides a multiplier effect. When women and girls are more educated, they have greater decision-making power in their households, are less likely to be recruited by extremists, and have healthier and better educated children. Before I ask my question, I will say, someone asked who were the good guys and the bad guys. And as the past chief of staff to the Illinois State Treasurer and the current co-chair on the Caucus of Black Women and Girls, I do feel that the United States of America needs to look at itself too. It's not just in developing countries that there's work to do. We have a lot of work to do here. But can you suggest the best leverage how can the U.S. best leverage foreign aid money into programs that help women become more financially secure so that people do feel comfortable with the money that we are spending and we are giving to these countries and programs?
Well, I would reiterate my fellow panelists' focus on data, on monitoring and evaluation, and let's stop making the same bad investments and really start scaling the ones that do work. The other thing I would really add, though, is, again, that focus on the private sector. One of the things the United States does do very well domestically is on procurement and requiring a diversity in procurement policies. We should be doing that more with both our own private sector that's working in developing countries and that are getting government funding to do that, as well as encouraging the private sector in those countries itself to diversify their procurement. Having those women-owned businesses that we've been talking about in the supply chains of those companies can make an enormous difference, and they have tremendous difficulty accessing finance. And then I'm just a very big fan of OPIC, and it's a program that gives back to the U.S. Treasury rather than only being taking. And there is no gender mandate that's explicitly in the OPEC program, and I think there could be, again, a lot of private sector and a great deal of leverage there.
Anybody else?
Yeah, Mrs. Skandarian said it well. I would reiterate just evaluating and really truly understanding what works is very critical. And investing in that knowledge base will help both, it'll help everybody across the developing world. And so I think investing in the knowledge base of what works and what doesn't work, which is so underinvested in developing countries, is essential. And, Mrs. Skandarian mentioned OPIC. I will say, thinking a little more innovatively about how aid organizations can invest and work with the private sector is key. If you look at Norway, the government has it's hard to say this, the government has a private equity fund, Norfund, right? Completely private equity, Silicon Valley style, does investments with returns. And they're playing around with what their role should be and how they should how they should structure that role. And I think it's interesting to see how that will evolve over time and whether that's an interesting model. But I think thinking of innovative models of how to structure our interactions is important.
Well, just very quickly, we're all singing from the same hymnal. But I think in terms of the private sector, there's some really impactful, innovative work going on using supply chains and value chains, and government participating in some of these collaborations in ways that we've talked about and haven't talked about, which I think is critically important. And then I would say incentives. Incentives to change behavior. You talked, Congresswoman, about education. What does it take to keep that girl in school? How do you affect the families that often want to push them into a child marriage, say? So incentive policies that help us do what we were intending to do.
If I would say to you, can you think of a program right now that you would tell us we should not repeat? Do you have programs in your mind? You don't have to tell me. I just want to know. Yes, you do. Okay. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kelly. And we turn to Mr. Donovan of New York.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You have identified, outlined, and vividly described what the issues are. I appreciate that for someone who's trying to understand it. I have one question, but it's actually in two parts, and I open it up to the panel. A lot of the things that you have identified as the problems are caused by countries in which we don't create their laws and we don't We don't support their culture and how they treat women. What influence could the United States use, since we can't change their laws? And I think some of my colleagues hit on this peripherally. What leverage could we use to encourage countries to change those laws besides appropriations? Our appropriations committee will do that. But what kind of policies, what kind of things could we do to influence some countries to change either their laws or their cultures and how they treat women? And the other part of my question would be, what laws could we propose? What could this committee do in order to advance, I don't want to even say advance, get up to speed of how the cultures ought to treat the female populations of their countries? Part of my great interest in this is I have a 2-year-old daughter. So women's interests they've always been an interest of mine. And I don't want to say, Madam Chairman, because I'm interested in women, but it's always been a concern of mine, the equality of women's rights in our country. But now that I'm on foreign affairs and I'm seeing the disparity in how women are treated in other parts of our world, I just like your expertise in how, again, our country can influence or encourage or use our leverage to advance women's rights elsewhere, and then what can this committee actually do? And I just leave it in any order to the panel as a whole.
Well, I'll kick it off by saying one thing that has always impressed me is not the lecture from the West so much that makes the difference, but our ability to help raise up the voices within the country who want this kind of change, women who want family law reform, who can not only succeed at doing it when they come together, but actually help their sisters in other countries who are in the same kinds of cultures and wondering, how do we get there?
As you said before, pressure from the bottom.
Well, bringing women together so that the best practices in one place can be understood and applied in ways that are appropriate to the other place, validating their efforts and enabling others to benefit from those best practices.
Thank you for that question. It's a hard question. I guess I would just say that it's not just laws, because in a lot of these places you can set all the laws you want, but whether they're actually adhered to is a different matter. And so I think, as Ambassador Verveer said, like thinking through how we actually get women's, sort of the perception of women changed on the ground is really difficult, is kind of key, not just the laws. So, you know, as women start to participate more and more, it seems that the attitudes start to change. So the example I gave was from India, where a regulation required women to be part of local government, very low-level local government, and it didn't change expenditures, but it did change people's perceptions that women were good decision makers, and they were more likely, the men were more likely to think that. So I think kind of thinking through not just what laws, but how do you actually, change things on the ground that when the laws come in, they actually will have impact is probably important as well.
But the Indian government changed that law. We can't control what laws the Indian government passes. So I'm trying to figure out, how could we influence? Ambassador, I think your comments are pertinent to that. What leverage could we use? And then again, if there's something that this committee could put forth.
I would very much echo Ambassador Verveer's use of best practice. The best learning is peer learning, and it's often very difficult for people to hear an American voice suggesting something and hearing another woman, another company, another bank from a developing country talk about their experience. We've done some amazing work in Jordan in microinsurance that's benefited women's maternal health tremendously over the last 3 years. The insurance company we work with just came back from Egypt, where they were spreading the gospel. Private company, it wasn't a government mandate, government program at all, whereas in Egypt, the government had requested this private company to come and explain how they had gotten this product to work so successfully. And that's going to be so much more powerful than anything that we could say. I'd also just say we have a very loud, or could have a very loud voice in international fora that I don't think we always use. In the subject of financial inclusion at the G20, we're not advocating for any of these issues as a government. We're very focused on, issues about anti-terrorism financing, money laundering, all of which is very, very important, but we don't even add this as an issue that we are standing with those other 19 countries and advocating for.
There might have been an opportunity missed there. Yes, thank you very much. I yield whatever little time I don't have left back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donovan. And we now go to Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey, chairman of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Human Rights, and International Operations.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I do want to thank Ed Royce and Elliot Engel for calling this important hearing. Ambassador, it's so great to see you again. And welcome to our other very distinguished witnesses. Just a couple of points, because so much has already been said, and I got here a little late, so I was very late in asking my questions. But I would like to comment on the shift, and maybe you might want to comment on it as well. I've written 2 laws on microcredit financing, targeting the poorest of the poor, reauthorizing the funding, but that has changed dramatically and radically, as you know better than anyone else. Now, where we used to rely on donor support, obviously, and you've all testified to this, USAID says that more than half of the financing provided by microfinancing institutions now comes from deposits, as you know so well, with much of the remaining from private capital. And again, I think my good friend from Staten Island made a very good point. What can we do to accelerate that or to keep that trajectory so that more people are reached? CARE points out that women still lag behind men in access to financial services by 7% worldwide, 9% in developing countries. So that disparity certainly and gap must be closed. I would note, and your points about cell phones were excellent. You all made very good points about that. When we were going and doing our part to try to resource the Ebola crisis, one of the biggest takeaways was how cell phones were the bridge between best practices, including what do you do if somebody passes, don't touch the body. That was all being sent out via cell phones. Radio was there, cell phones was the dominant media, if you will, that was used there. Financial inclusion, obviously that is extremely important as a driver. You might want to speak to that. And finally, today, in about 2 hours, the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Reauthorization Act, bill that I've introduced, joined by my good friend and colleague Karen Bass, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, Chairman Royce, Ms. Frankel, and others, will be on the floor. And we have new language in this, besides reauthorizing the TPVA of 2000, 2005, the International Megan's Law, and the William Wilberforce Act, to the tune of $534 million over 4 years. It will do a number of these best practices of training procurement officers so that they know what to look for in trafficking. And you might speak in a parallel way, because I think poverty is still one of the major drivers behind trafficking, how we might also get procurement officers and others, because we buy an awful lot in this country, to be more aware of how they could be helpful in this important and noble battle as well. Ambassador.
Well, thank you, Congressman Smith. It's always good to see you, and thank you for your leadership on so many issues we mutually care about, whether it's son preference or human trafficking. On the trafficking piece, I think this supply chain is a really important issue, and it's been manifested in other ways, but the work that's being done to understand where is slavery injecting itself and what end products have utilized and tapped that in terms of undermining people's human rights, I think is a very important piece. And as you have so well stated, trafficking would not be the multi-billion-dollar criminal industry it is today if people had economic viability. Traffickers prey on people who are desperate to come out of the straits that they're in, and they're coerced and conned, and we know what happens. So I think this is a very important place. You've been on this issue a long time. This is another critical element as far as I understand. And quickly on the cell phone, we've talked a lot about the financial transaction side of it, but your point about Ebola is one point I don't want us to miss, which is the critical information, health information inventory information on your product lines, how to move them, information for women to protect themselves from violence. A lot of that is happening through the cell phone today. That's why it's become such a critical tool, particularly for poor women.
Yeah, I'll just add on the cell phones. I think Ambassador Revere is absolutely right. There's lots of evidence that people are able to manage also their health lives better with cell phones. You can remind them to take medication that has to be taken continuously, and they do, and they respond to it. You can, in all sorts of ways, cell phones are such a big part of people's lives in the developing world that they really weren't here at the same sort of level of development in any way. And I think they're critical not just to that, but also, we did a bunch of work on the Ebola crisis when it was happening in Sierra Leone, and we wanted to track the economic effects it was having and whether women were pulling away from health services because they're worried about catching Ebola. And we did all of that data collection by cell phones because we'd been working in Sierra Leone for several years. We had people's phone numbers, and we ended up being able to trace out, literally every month, we were running a quick survey of a few thousand people in Sierra Leone to track what was happening and how they were responding. And so I think not just in terms of good for people, but in terms of also being able to understand crisis situations, they've been very useful.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. And now we turn to Ambassador Wagner of Missouri.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for hosting such an excellent hearing. As a woman on both financial services and the Foreign Affairs committees, I'm highly concerned about women's economic empowerment, and I very much appreciate your testimonies. Far too many of the world's women live in the cash economy without access to financial markets and services. Dr. Surrey, I had the chance to read some of your work on financial services innovations that improve financial inclusion. I was particularly interested in your National Bureau of Economic Research paper published last fall, which cited the importance of equipping commercial savings products with features that guide clients toward better financial planning. From text messages that remind people to save, to automatic withdrawal of savings from paychecks. Tell me, how can the private sector, Dr. Surrey, in developing countries improve how the poor are saving?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. It's a great question. I think the private sector is starting to innovate a little around financial tools, but they are worried about risk. The financial systems are small, not that concrete, not that, sort of stable. And so I think they're worried about risk. So they do experiment a little, like with savings accounts, as you saw from our work. But I think encouraging them to provide a variety of products. I think what we've learned from microfinance is one hat doesn't fit all. I don't walk into the bank and there's one savings product and one credit product. There has to be a variety that meets different types of people's needs. And so I think trying to encourage the private sector to innovate around the types of products is one. And then, we've talked about this a bit before, is kind of helping them deal with that risk a little. If they're really worried about risk, can we de-risk some of the things they're doing so that they're less worried and can invest and innovate more? And then I think also doing the research piece around what works and what doesn't work. That piece is really about kind of how do we think about what works in the financial tool set for people in developing countries. And I think we need that knowledge to be able to then go to the private sector and say, look, this didn't work, don't do it. The same way we were talking about earlier here. We sort of can bring knowledge even to the private sector to show them what's working and what's not working.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Ms. Iskandarian, I appreciate your leadership at Women's World Banking. I had the opportunity to look at your partnership to create Jordan's first health micro insurance product to directly address hospitalization costs. I learned that many existing health microinsurance products in Jordan exclude pregnancy and prenatal care. Do you find that this is the case in many parts of the world? And how can policymakers encourage the launch of microinsurance products that better support pregnancy care?
Thank you, Ambassador. That was not just a factor we see in Jordan, I'm afraid, but in many countries, insurance companies don't want to insure a risk that they know is going to actually happen. When a woman gets pregnant, we know what the outcome of that is going to be. So we unfortunately have found in many cases that is an exclusion. Part of the reason why this product has been so successful in Jordan, and we've now replicated it in 6 other countries, is that we do not exclude maternal care. We found that that is the one time in a woman's life that she will prioritize her own health over her children's or her spouse's or another family member's. And so it's both a good sales technique in the way that you can convince a woman to take on that insurance if she sees it meeting a need that she expresses. It was interesting, in Jordan, we even saw women who were sort of outside childbearing age find that organization, if they had, the organization offering the insurance, if they had identified that need and recognized that as something that should be insured.
So do you see those markets opening up at all, Ms. Iskandarian? I mean, in terms of maternity and prenatal care? And more across the world? You are seeing it happen?
We are. Microinsurance is just still a drop in the bucket in terms of what's needed. Again, technology is really very helpful because we're bringing the cost of those very small policies down. But I think there is a recognition that there's been quite a bit of research. Women do buy more insurance around the world than men. If you're going to appeal to women, you've got to meet their needs, and maternal health care is right at the top of those.
I think it is, and whatever we can do as a country and a society to make sure that we are encouraging policymakers to make that more readily available across the world, I think is very, very important. I believe, Madam Chairman, that I have run out of time. I have a wonderful question for you, Ambassador Verveer, but I will have to submit it in writing, so I yield back. Oh, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Well, let me thank former Ambassador Wagner, but also thank every member here of the panel for taking time out of your, I know, very busy schedules to come here today to testify on this subject, because I think this is going to be very helpful to the committee as we continue our work to try to accelerate economic growth in these societies and promote global health and stability by focusing on this issue, by focusing on ensuring that the women who serve as the backbone of stable societies are not left behind and have the tools necessary to further progress in this area. So thank you all very much for your work in this area and your testimony. And we stand adjourned.